Welcome, everyone. I'm Afa Dworkin, President and Artistic Director for the Sphinx organization. I have an incredible all-star panel here for a conversation that we've titled No Time Like the Present. My guests today are Kendra Ingram, President and CEO of the Marcus Performing Arts Center, Jenny Bilfield, President and CEO of Washington Performing Arts, and Abhijit Sengupta, who is the Director of Artistic Planning for Carnegie Hall. Welcome, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. So today's conversation, and if you're here for something else, stay with us because this conversation is definitely going to be amazing and innovative like no other. And we hope that everyone who is joining us this afternoon will participate by joining the conversation and sharing some of your questions, because we feel that that's the most important part of our engagement here. But today's conversation is centered around innovation. It essentially encourages us to pause and think about innovating in the age of global pandemic, and also reflecting on both challenges and opportunities of thinking creatively and innovatively when we're limited by certain circumstances, and also while planning ahead to a time when we will hopefully return. What are some of the lessons that we've learned during this period that may inform and in fact evolve some of what we're working on and planning for when we're in person and able to be on stage and enjoy a more intimate dialogue with our audiences? So we will explore some of those ideas and lessons, and of course, gladly engage in a conversation with our audiences. Before we go there, I'd love to encourage everyone who's listening to take a moment and define innovation on stage or off stage, however you think of innovation, in either one word or perhaps 30 seconds or less. And as you do that, I'll also invite members of my panel here to do the same. What does innovation mean to you in your line of work? Kendra, if I might throw it to you first.
Innovation for me, and specifically as President and CEO of a Performing Arts Center, equals survival. That's been the key word of the last 11 months for many of us, and survival and I would say resiliency kind of go hand in hand with innovation. I feel like both of those elements have really allowed us to innovate in ways I don't think we ever would have been able to before the pandemic. I feel like the team and I have really flexed our resiliency muscles, and that's again a direct correlation with innovation.
That's great. I certainly resonate with that. So we're hearing motives and themes of resiliency and survival, both from what that means existentially and what it means looking ahead in order to be able to get there. So that's great. Jenny, how do you see innovation from your seat today?
Well, Kendra's words definitely resonated. And in thinking about this, I jotted down a thought that I'll read, which is, I think innovation is very, sorry for the ambient parrot sounds in the background, everyone. He just said, wow. I think innovation is about the mindset of an organization that fuels acts of creative courage through partnership with others and leadership in our community. So I think innovation is often thought of as something that just happens within an organization. But especially at this time, I felt that our patrons and the artists we work with, teaching artists, presented artists, were all pulling with us. And that was incredibly powerful and important. And we don't innovate in a vacuum. So we provide a platform for people to do their best work. We bring our patrons along, and those relationships matter. So were it not for the partnerships and those relationships, innovation would be impossible. And that's definitely baked into who we are. So that's what I would say.
I love that. I think I'm hearing something so resonant with the theme of our convening our time this weekend, so innovating in unity. I think it's right that sometimes in our sector, we think of innovation as something we should just do as an activity. But
Right.
here, I think the pandemic has encouraged us to contextualize innovation and rely upon others in some cases to be able to help us get someplace. And recognizing how complex the fabric of our communities is and how many people can help.
Yes.
That's definitely been really inspiring. Ab, I wonder if you might share from your perspective, when you think innovation, what comes to mind?
Yeah, well, I mean, both Kendra and Jenny have already covered a lot of ground in terms of the roles that we play. If I could pick up where Jenny was sort of heading and say that for me, the idea of an organization becoming so closely linked to the world around it and to the questions and the themes that come up in our daily lives in social discourse and political discourse and artistic, cultural discourse, everything like that, so that the organization itself, regardless of how large it is, begins to behave like an artist and is very, very sensitive to the world around it. And I mean, the idea of anticipation came up. I mean, that's been a lesson for all of us in this period. I mean, even those of us who think of ourselves as being, switched on or well-read or up on current events, probably didn't anticipate what a pandemic could mean for our industry, regardless of the fact that we've been reading about pandemics for at least a decade now. So, so this idea of being able to evolve in that way, in a very organic sense, is really wrapped up in innovation in my mind these days.
Absolutely. Yeah, I like to pause on anticipation, which to me sometimes also comes with just not knowing. Anticipatory anxiety comes with some of this natural desire to innovate that we all have, but not being able to see ahead, because while we know quite a bit and learn continuously, there are certain things that are left in the unknown box. How do you innovate within what you don't know? What do you rely upon? So in that way, it's, I think probably the most beautiful thing I heard with that, Ab, was when an organization acts or becomes an artist. That's wonderful. And in some ways, that's a lesson we sometimes may need to pause on more and double up on, because the complexity of how we're structured and the various constituencies, sometimes with conflicting priorities that we aim to serve, do not allow us to remember the fact that we are in the arts. And as such, the best thing we can do is envision ourselves as an artist or a group of artists who can do things together. So I love how some of these lessons are reflective, but then you guys have added additional elements and embellishments that make me think ahead. And here I'd like to take us kind of pick up on one of the themes I was hearing and maybe zero in on maybe a recent instance since last March, when an element or an example of innovation perhaps showed you a lesson that was a bit unexpected, either into a positive direction or maybe not such a positive direction. And I don't know, I think I'll call on Jenny to take us somewhere with that.
Okay, well, so I can think about two examples, and it speaks a little bit to this question of resiliency. I mean, for many of our organizations, we struggle just to maintain our websites. And then, we're headlong into this, we're presenting digitally. Washington Performing Arts doesn't have its own venue, so we present all over Washington, DC, and we can be pretty nimble. But in figuring out how we would program for this new digital form, we really enlisted the creativity of everyone in our organization. So programming wasn't just the responsibility of only the programmers, but people entered with many different creative ideas, and we became a little bit more sort of agnostic about where the ideas were coming from, and institutionally created some structures to program. So within about 2 or 3 weeks, we created the Digital Engagement Focus Team, DEFT, which comprised people across all of our departments except for senior staff. And it really harnessed the energy and the knowledge and the sort of native technology mindset of our team in suggesting formats and content from around all of our programs. So we had teaching artists in our education program doing global programs that could be offered to families. All of a sudden, the the programmatic delineations fell away and all of the ideas tumbled forth. But it was a challenging thing to structure because there was a question of like, who leads this? Who makes decisions? What are we going towards? What we knew is we were going forward, but we weren't really sure what the destination was. So there was that ambiguity, which for organizations that highly structure the presentation of creativity felt a bit at odds. By the same token, we had members of our team step forward who were and are extraordinarily skilled artists, but whose professional work at Washington Performing Arts is really different. So one is our Chief Operating Officer and Director of Finance, Lorenzo Evans, who is trained and worked for many years as a hip hop artist, has his own company. And he became a really strong proponent of some of our Mars Arts DC programming and curated a series of local artists and dance films that paired solo choreographers or dance makers with local businesses to focus on entrepreneurship. So we saw this, enormous creativity bubble forth from people because we were, evaporating some of these programmatic delineations and really just sourcing the creativity within the team. That's going to fundamentally change the way we think about the ideation process, the creative process going forward. And for me, that was both the challenge structurally, because, how do we make decisions in that way, but also just to see the talent within the organization and people step forward from new perspectives. So those are some of the real highlights for me. And I think our board has been especially appreciative of the portfolio that people bring to this.
Absolutely. So I'm hearing themes of agility and really looking inward and looking at and rediscovering the creativity that's already there, and perhaps necessitated by circumstances, but at the same time really tapping into what's already there and thinking without sort of definitions and usual borders that are sometimes imposed by maybe outdated thinking or just maybe a lack of freedom, so to speak, to imagine and think in a new way. So I love those examples. Ab, I wonder if you might have something to add too about an example that you've that you could recall in recent history where you might have had to think creatively and employ innovation in a way that's not conventional, and perhaps any lessons from that.
Well, I think that somebody mentioned earlier, maybe it was you, Afa, the amount of digital content that we've all been producing, and Jenny just talked about their platform, and so naturally, we did the same. And one of the things that I should say that maybe it took us a couple of weeks to really organize ourselves. I mean, some other organizations went out before we did, but we invested considerable conversation internally as to what the digital platform could look like, because we had a few things that were hampering us. One is that our hall was not available to us, and one of the themes that kept coming up in our conversations is, in a way, that's our greatest artist, that's our greatest asset, is the hall itself, and that to have that absent in these programs was something that we were all trying to sort of reconcile in our minds. And so we ended up in a kind of sort of narrative style that was a little bit more documentary rather than performance based, and suddenly we all found ourselves doing things that certainly none of us were really trained to do, but ever thought we would be doing. Writing scripts, creating, being showrunners, doing very detailed calculations of a run of show, and figuring out how to use Zoom and combine that with prompts as moderators so that we capture in conversation, which then have to be edited. I mean, all the things that all of us, I'm sure are very familiar with. So, and what we found is it was, although, there's a lot of internal exchange of ideas and conversation, there were, I should say, in the before times when we were doing concerts on stage, this gave us an opportunity to really integrate our workflows in a way that hadn't been so close before. I mean, everything from I affectionately call them the elite social media team, directly speaking with, artists and figuring out, okay, well, what's your, which platform would you want us to use? And can we use this content or that content to our colleagues in development, talking about, which sponsors would be interested in different context, in different content, and how we can recognize them. So we now have a very, very large working team. It's not as, we have to come up with a good acronym like DEFT, but it's a standing team that meets once a week. From that team, and I mean, when I say large, it's something like 25 people, and it actually takes the input of that many people to make sure we cover all of our bases. And what we have found is that this is, going back to what I was saying earlier, it allows us to really feel like we're responding to the shifting landscape beneath our feet. Because as Jenny was saying, we've become very agnostic about where the ideas come from. It could come from absolutely anywhere, a reminder, a thought, an inspiration. So, we've been putting out, the sort of cadence of how often we produce the events has shifted over time. And the format has shifted as we've learned, but we've created now a considerable library of content that we put out under the Live with Carnegie Hall digital platform. It also has a very healthy component in Learn with Carnegie Hall, which is through our Wild Music Institute, our education wing, as we started developing these ideas, it occurred to us that a lot of the ideas and a lot of the stories that artists wanted to tell with this platform had such a strong education component to it, sometimes a social justice component to it. And so we wanted to make sure that Wild Music Institute had its own channel, so to speak. And so we've been producing content under Learn with Carnegie Hall. So this has been, not only a wonderful way for us to remain active and connected to audiences, but it's been an incredible sort of learning opportunity for us internally on how we can work more closely together. We've now built out areas of the website where there are shared documents, and we have to automate certain things so that all the right people are notified when an action is taken. So it's been time consuming, very detail oriented, but very invigorating at the same time for everybody involved, because we feel like we're developing a new way of working together that really ties together lots and lots of people.
Absolutely. Yeah, I like how we're tapping into some of these themes of collaboration as well, and kind of doubling down on how much can be accomplished when we are agnostic, and maybe more than agnostic about where ideas come from, maybe more like proactively seeking them from anywhere else, and really capitalizing. I'm going to want to go take our dialogue into the sphere of before pandemic times and post-pandemic times, the new time terminology that we've all been using. But before we go there, and Kendra, I'd like you to start thinking about that. I just want to remind our audience members to use the Q&A function in your attendee hub, because this conversation only becomes useful if we hear your voices and shape the discussion based upon your own impressions and maybe some ideas that you may offer to the field. So I just want to make sure that's available for you. But Kendra, I wondered if you could continue on this theme, but talk a little about your vision from where you sit now, in terms of which are some of the lessons you anticipate taking with you into the post-pandemic times when we arrive there.
The before times, I've used that term so many times. We're going to be talking about that, kind of like we did with 9/11, where it was like, remember before 9/11, this is how things were, and post. Just to provide a little context to the attendees, I started as president and CEO of the Marcus Center on March 9. So my first meeting on my first day was determining whether or not we were going to cancel our Broadway show that was happening the following week. And by the end of that week, I had fortunately met all of our resident partners in the venue, like AB. Our venue is kind of our main asset as well. We're a multi-venue performing arts center. And within, a week of my first day, we had closed the venue, and it's been closed essentially, mostly ever since. So I came into this organization having met my direct reports once before in person, and having not met all the full staff in person. So when we closed down, there's still to this moment people I haven't seen in person at all. So and again, I took over the role from the previous CEO, who had been president for 20 years. The staff tenure in the organization, many people that were 20 plus years in the organization. So it had been a very consistent, stable, situation. I took over a very solid organization. That wasn't like there was a lot of problems. So you throw on the pandemic, shutting down the venue, this new CEO who's like, completely different than the one before, biracial Black woman, who's a different age group, coming from a different background, different, work experience. And I feel like, the before times just almost evaporated for my organization, because we had to basically, again, this concept of resiliency and survival had to happen really quickly. So, I just want to give that all of my responses are kind of coming from that place. And I think, again, continuing on the theme of what Jenny and both Ab said, this idea of innovative ideas coming from, I would say, unexpected places in our organization is something that really resonates with me. And I feel like some of the most innovative ideas that we've had have come from folks whose that's not their job to do that. So the after times, we are 1000% going to hold on to that concept of regular engagement. I think the other thing, coming from a legacy organization where you have so much tenure, and I'm sure Ab can probably relate to this, is that folks are not as used to collaborating as much. There's a little bit of siloism, and not in a bad way, just kind of a order of things way that people are used to. Well, I do this thing on front of house, and I don't really go out of my lane. So not only are we not asking for people to give innovation outside of their area, they're not even thinking that that's okay, or that's something that would be welcomed. And I think that is probably the biggest hold on that we're going to have when in the after, which the after is coming soon, by the way. The after is going to be here in a couple months, I hope.
Hallelujah.
Yes. I'm sitting on a lot of calls this morning about public health, and things are looking up. So yeah, I think that's probably the thing that both the staff and I, and the board actually too, have really just been really pleased with. And now the staff is actually starting to think, oh, I can, reach out to Kendra, or reach out to, our VP of marketing or development with ideas, and we're going to be together more frequently now. We're not just going to have our department function gatherings. There's going to be more opportunity for people to share. So that really was an unexpected outcome, I think, of all of this.
Absolutely. So a little bit kind of digging into that, but by necessity, certain liberties have been afforded to all of us. Some of the things that we thought heretofore to be rigid, not possible, unconventional, unusual, have become more real and realistic. So we've experimented and leaned upon one another, and hopefully some of those restrictions and some of that liberation, something we can really harness and hold on to as we go into the post-pandemic times, which is great. I wanted to talk a little there's the adage of necessity being mother of invention. I've seen innovation like nobody's business during this pandemic. Some of the organizations I would otherwise never term as innovative or agile or flexible have shown some beautiful things artistically. I've certainly been inspired, challenged, but then to add just a little bit of a, not a skeptical, but an inquisitive element or nuance to what I'm saying is that if we've been able to innovate in that space where we have been courageous about format, use of technology, involvement of hybrid conferences and performances, all sorts of things, collaboration, taking ideas from somebody who doesn't occupy a particular post, you know, if we've seen that, imagine how we can innovate and reimagine ourselves, all of us, as institutions who are certainly, yes, stewards of arts and culture, but with an ethos that is not devoid of social justice. How might we do, both individually and collectively, if we all imagine that that becomes part of the essential and integral mission statement for all of us, where it's not one or two organizations or a grassroots organization here and there whose focus is at the intersection of social justice and the arts, but if every large institution, in fact, inherits and owns a piece of that. So where I hope to go is, in the next phase of this conversation, is maybe where do you see some of the opportunities there for some of the traditional institutions, maybe more storied, tenured institutions, and or maybe some mid-sized institutions which have been more agile? How do we, where is there an opportunity today that maybe wasn't there before? And if it's there, how do we harness and tap into it and really fully capitalize on that? Feel free, anyone, to take this one, and if you don't, I'll call on somebody.
Actually, this is getting my juices flowing because I'm actually very excited about this. First of all, we can't underestimate the power of a movement, right? So if any one of our institutions had a year ago said, you know what, we think we're going to abandon live performance and instead we're going to do everything virtually, all the sort of daggers of our field, which can point very quickly on a dime in judgment and in criticism, would point to that organization and say, oh, they've abandoned it. This is, you know, how can we do this? We're not offering things live. There would have been so much judgment that it could have either been an extinction event or paralyzing. However, now that it's quite the opposite, that if we don't find ways to reimagine our connection with artists and audiences, that will be the extinction event. So the fact that we're doing this as a field, that we're talking to each other, looking at best practices, sharing knowledge about licensing and IP and you know, audience sort of attention span and all of this, we have made a major step forward as a field, and it would shame on us if we don't use and sustain these habits. When it comes to social justice and just the horror that we all witnessed with the murders and the insurrection and the reality of what is going on in the world around us, and we watched it from our homes alongside friends and family, that also has been in the most horrible ways, but an important point of galvanizing. And I think that if we look at our ability to tell stories and to foreground artists and members of our wider community, whether it's patrons, artists, teachers, students, in the most intimate way, and we can do that with film, we can do that with video, we can do that with Zoom and forums like this, then I feel really confident that we can bring audiences along with us, because this lens that we provide and the platform that we provide enables people to tell stories in a compelling way. And it's not about the lecture, it's not about speaking from a point of, you know, on high and with a sort of different terraces of authority and power. It's actually about speaking with people, alongside people at a very human level, and using technology to help us, so that as people respond to what artists are expressing, and to, you know, Ab's sort of beautiful phrase about institutions becoming like an artist and sensitive to the world, I think our audiences will follow. And I think there's a much greater capacity. I wish that in a way we could abandon this word innovation, because we should always innovate, and the sense of social justice, because we should be living and breathing organisms that reflect the molecules around us. If we have to have this, intermediary space where we call it a thing so that it focuses our attention, then that's great. But I think every organization, and we're seeing this, at high organizations of all sizes, it can't just be the scrappy, grassroots organizations, and it isn't. And that's the thing we have to hold on to. And this notion of the humanity that is channeled through our organizations, and using this technology to spotlight it.
Absolutely, that's beautifully said, and I think, Kendra, I'd love for you to add here. I want to take what Jenny says and maybe wrap it around the artistic piece. I wonder where you see those opportunities in evolving the manner in which we think about artist engagement. I know we focus a lot about on audience engagement, and in many ways, our community is all reciprocal, right? So removing some of these barriers and erasing some of the formality of the roles is beautiful. I also want to encourage and inspire, where possible, my colleagues and friends who hold the power to program things, to think about programming outside the box and thinking about representation there. Can you maybe take us there and share where you see some of those opportunities as it relates to actual programming and artist engagement?
I think we'll talk about the before times, and the after times is also before George Floyd and after George Floyd. I think, I haven't been, kicking around in this world as long as some of our mentors and elders who have lived through the civil rights movement and have been fighting this fight way longer than we have. But I can say, and I feel the after times that happened immediately after George Floyd's murder was something that I have not seen in my adult life or in my lifetime in general, and certainly not in my professional life, with the openness and call for action among white colleagues that I've never seen before. And I think that we've talked about this a number of times. I'm sure you're talking about it in a number of different sessions. We absolutely have to grab hold of that and now really push. I had my soon-to-be board chair, and I call him out. He knows I do this every time. A white man, 60 plus, who called me about a week after we put out our BLM statement, like everybody else did, and said, he got the call, and he's like, I really want to talk to you about this. I have a really big concern. And I was like, uh-oh. And he said, it's not enough. We have to do more, and we need an action plan. And I want to know what that is. And I was just like, this is the moment. This is the moment. So I feel like, when you're talking about artists, one of the things that we're thinking about, I serve on a couple different service organization boards, the Broadway League, Association of Performing Arts Professionals. And what we're thinking about specifically with artists is really holding the programming people accountable now. So we've all said we commit to community engagement and diversity and inclusion, and our stages represent, blah, 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 BIPOC voices. But now what we're saying is measure that. We're going to ensure, and Afa, I know you have been on this way longer than any of us. You were saying, I remember you saying, like, way back in this year and many years previous, put a % of your budget to advancing these initiatives. Put a % of your budget to recruiting, hiring, and retaining people in leadership roles. And this is where I feel like this is the key now, and particularly in programming, but even on an institutional leadership level, we now need to commit and pledge publicly, holding ourselves accountable. X % of our budget's going to go to to these initiatives. X % of our programming, we are committing minimum to amplifying these voices. And my big push right now, which Afa knows because I've beat it into her Sphinx leaders, is empowering specifically Black and Brown individuals to aim towards the C-suite, because that is truly where not only power in making these decisions, but also in frankly, wealth building in our communities is going to happen. So that, I think, you know, that's sort of answering your question, Afa, but I see us from a programming perspective specifically putting that spelling out specifically what we are going to commit to, holding ourselves accountable to that, measuring that, and then sharing that this is how we're progressing. That's really where I think we can make a big difference from what we've said and done before.
Absolutely. I love that, of course. And yesterday's wonderful plenary speaker, Elizabeth Alexander, told us that true unity isn't really possible without accountability, which I absolutely, that's just poetry. And it's also so very true. And in a way, accountability in a fashion that inspires us, impels us to do the right thing, doesn't guilt us into doing the right thing. And I kind of want to double down on that and go to Ab next before we open it up to questions in a few minutes. Ab, I wonder, it's such a complex institution you find yourself amidst. I'm sure the variety of priorities and constituencies you have to manage and think about as you plot and innovate in programming is probably greatly varied and complex beyond anyone's understanding, really. But I wonder if you might say or share a bit, how do we kind of double down on what Kendra is saying in a way she's encouraging us to invest into leaders, invest into budgets, invest into this energy that's coming from our board leadership. Now to programming and artist engagement, how do we actually practice? I've called for 15% minimum for all artists engaged and music played to be by Black and Brown composers or Black and Brown artists. And sometimes people, certainly in a valid fashion, will question where that 15% comes from. And to me, that's the bare minimum. And I just think in an extremely rudimentary fashion, let's at least look at population representation. It doesn't even begin to scratch it. But if we're looking at African-American population being at about 14% and Latinx now closer to 18, 19%, if we were remotely to be talking about equity, we would be way higher, cumulatively speaking. So we must start someplace and then have a graduated goal, I would imagine. But how do you actually practice that? And what enters your mind when you think about relevance in programming and that type of innovation?
That's glad you saved the easy question for me.
Of course.
So
Friend.
You know, just like everybody else, as Kendra was just sort of describing, you know, we've been having a lot of soul searching conversations. One of the things I have to say that I'm both relieved and proud of, I guess maybe would be the complex sort of feeling I have about it, is that Carnegie Hall has very much been on the right side of history throughout its 130 years of being in existence. Andrew Carnegie laid the cornerstone of the building and said, you know, all good causes shall here find a platform. And from the earliest days, that has always been the case at Carnegie Hall. And even when performers were not welcome in other venues, they were welcome at Carnegie Hall. So we're very proud of that legacy. And we're having a lot of these soul searching conversations internally for our own information, as well as that of our colleagues in other departments. We've done, I guess, kind of an audit is the best word I would use to describe it, to actually go through. I mean, it's a little complex because you have to make a few guesses about how people would identify. And so this is certainly not for public consumption, but I think in terms of the 15% goal that you were just describing, Afa, I think Carnegie Hall was very relieved to discover that we are, you know, well north of 20, in fact, in terms of representation of BIPOC artists across all of our programs. In practice, I think there's one thing, Kendra, you said something that really resonated with me: hold programming people accountable. You know, I think one of the things that we are that we take very seriously, and we're even pushing further in this direction, is for the programming people to also understand what the marketing considerations are, what what makes for successful PR, how development, needs to interact with the artists, because innovation shouldn't only be the sort of province of the programming. Innovation has to happen in all of the departments in a coordinated and synchronized way, so that you can achieve sort of what I was putting up as this kind of like picture of an artist, of an organization acting like an artist. And so I mean, I think anybody on this call who is in a planning or programming position, will have some story about wanting to try something adventurous or innovative that potentially didn't end up coming to fruition because there was too much risk for the box office, or there was nobody who was going to sponsor that. So it's something that we have to make sure that, yes, we hold programming people accountable, but also that we engender and encourage innovation across the board from all the different departments. For us, the digital platforms have allowed us to be far more nimble than we would otherwise be able to, we otherwise could be. I mean, Carnegie Hall has 3 different stages that, present music of all types. That's our commitment, is to present the best in all music. And so it takes years and years of planning to bring that to fruition and bring that to the stages. But with the digital platforms, and I think I've shared some links that I invite everybody to check out when they have a moment. We've been able to really respond to what's really happening in the world. So I just selected 4 different things. One was commemorating the sudden and unexpected passing of one of our treasured artists, cellist Lynn Harrell. Another was speaking about the George Floyd murder. And that was such a I mean, it was an unforgettable moment in our nation's history, as Kendra said. I mean, I'd certainly never experienced anything like that in my life. So we actually collaborated with Sphinx, in fact, to present Joel Thompson's 7 Last Words of the Unarmed as a digital presentation. We, in the fall, this past November, did a live streaming episode remembering Ruth Bader Ginsburg that we were able to produce and release within, I think, something like 2 weeks or something of her passing, 2 or 3 weeks of her passing. And then in December, we did one celebrating frontline medical workers, where we had incredible partners like Joshua Bell and Anthony Roth Costanzo involved. But rather than having the usual suspects performing, we actually gave the platform to frontline medical workers who also were musicians to perform in collaboration with these artists. So that's an example of the ways in which we think that using technology and finding a different approach and thinking of it as a tool rather than a limitation to what we normally do on the stage, that we could be far more connected and closely tied to our to the world, but most importantly to audiences and to people, so that what we are putting out and how we show up in that social media world resonates with what they're encountering and how they're living their lives a little bit more.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much for that comprehensive answer, Ab. I know there's a lot of complexity to all of that, but I think that reflective and relevant programming that's responsive to what's around us is definitely a wonderful lesson for us for our awareness. I'd like next to move to our the portion of the session where we're in a dialogue with the audience. There's some wonderful questions already lined up. And the first question here is essentially innovation goes hand in hand with collaboration, but then collaboration between various organizations can be complex. What are some of the best practices or advice that you might have during this time when working with organizations that may have competing priorities or cultures even? Jenny, I wonder if you might take that one.
Sure. No, this is something that really hits home for me and for us, because as I mentioned, we don't have our own venue to manage or operate, and we don't work with a collective bargaining agreement. So we have always presented performances in collaboration with host spaces, but also with organizations throughout Washington, D.C. In fact, They range from the DC public school system to various embassies, because this is an epicenter of diplomatic community, to organizations that are 30 times our size or more. Washington Performing Arts Kennedy Center, spoken word group. So we collaborate all over the city, both physically and artistically. And in fact, we actually started working on a new mission statement about a year and a half ago. And the opening line is, "We champion the arts as a unifying force." So this notion of creating momentum and value and new experiences is done best when we can do it in partnership. Very often collaboration for many means that, like, I try to get you to do it my way, and we call it a collaboration. And actually what I most love is when there's like even the tiniest idea where there's a mission alignment, there's a values alignment. I think value is almost more important than mission, because if there is a desire to reach people in a very specific way, even if we're talking about organizations outside the arts, within the arts, then sometimes those little granular connections can turn into very powerful sources of programs. So, when we think about the nucleus of an idea, a program that an artist might bring to us, we immediately begin to think about the tentacles that program reaches and speaks to. And so a few years ago, we had a big immersive program around Jimmy Lopez's oratorio, Dreamers, which was exactly about that, a multi-movement work, which we co-commissioned. Cal Performances took the lead. But in Washington, DC, there is a huge Latinx community and many organizations that work with community members who are undocumented, and many of whom have come here and are studying in the Carlos Rosario International Adult Charter School. Working on this project and having Jimmy in a classroom with students, adult students, some of whom were artists, some of whom were building their language skills, their writing skills, was incredibly powerful. And so it was the idea and the content of that work that propelled that collaboration and made our program not only richer, but also, frankly, brought new sensitivities to us. For example, the sort of fatigue of people constantly speaking about the harrowing process of moving to America, that we became aware through the feedback that we received that there was sort of an emotional limit that we needed to be respectful of. And as much as we as institutions try to be to see as broadly as possible, these collaborations are essential in helping us tune ourselves to new ways of viewing, in some cases, well-intentioned efforts, but also seeing opportunities for connection. So it is messier, it's more time-consuming, there's more ambiguity. But again, if the values are there and art is at the nucleus, then people really want to be part of those collaborations. And as a presenter without our own space, the way that we differentiate ourselves is by how we, as a Washington, DC based institution, show up through collaborations and by honoring the trajectory of an artist's idea. So I would advise that those hours of conversation are always worth it. And if something doesn't come to fruition now, playing the long game and seeing that some relationships may materialize. And if you have the dialogue with peer organizations and artists, they will, come back in another form.
Absolutely. No, that's wonderful. We've got a number of wonderful questions and only too short a time, but Ab, I actually wondered this may be good to hear from you. The focus on digital content seems to be an innovation coming this year, and it's talking really about digital innovation seems to be the theme. How do you see it being sustainably incorporated into an organization's DNA? I wonder if you might talk a little about that.
Happy to. I think I mentioned earlier this idea that for many of us, the digital content this year has been a result of a bit of a limitation. We're not able to gather, we're not able to gain access to a venue or something like that. And I hope that it can actually become a tool. And one of the reasons that we were, you know, a little slow out of the gates with this at Carnegie is that, you know, we try not to take things on that we don't intend to continue doing, and you know, into the future. And so for me, that idea that innovation has this component of evolution as opposed to revolution, you know, our hope is that we will continue to sharpen our skills around the digital content, um, so that it will continue to adapt. It will continue to be a tool that helps us enhance and deepen engagement around what happens on stage. That's why we took this narrative storytelling tack with those programs as opposed to more of a performance approach. And you know, for us, it's a little more difficult to do this because we really are a presenter. But I hope that there are organizations out there who will begin to really experiment with digital presentations and create something that is something new and very authentic to that format, you know, combining music. I mean, we've seen some really wonderful examples of it already in this period. And I, for one, just as a consumer of that kind of content, would love to see even more. And that could be an opportunity where organizations can collaborate. So for me, it's, you know, I think that I have high hopes that we as a field will learn to use it as a tool. And if it becomes a tool that you understand how it can enhance your activities, you know, on stage, then I think it becomes part of the DNA of the organization.
Absolutely. So a tool for innovation and augmenting what we do, but also in our experience too, we've seen that use of the digital space has also opened up new and unexpected channels and really address the issue of access. Some of this excellent programming that we all do and some of this innovative programming is actually not very accessible otherwise, literally and physically. And when removing cost to some things and making something equally accessible online, it can often be enriching and in fact could play into that sustainability piece. Because if something actually costs less money, but makes what you do more out there in the open and available to connect with audiences, that it can become part of one's DNA. We probably have time for a couple more questions. There's one here that talks about how do you logistically ask for innovative ideas from an entire organization in a manner that does not feel overwhelming? That's very practical. I like that. Kendra, I wonder if you'd take it.
Sure, and I'm going to answer that question and also tag on to Ab's answer as well. You know, I think the two big lessons we learned about digital content is that, you know, we all had this concern about the virtual fatigue and the screen fatigue. And I think that is real. I don't think that this platform is going to last in the same way that it has sustained us during this pandemic time. I mean, we've all used it. I mean, I personally watched the entire ring cycle on the Mets streaming, which I never would have done or had time to do, frankly, before. But that's not stopping me from wanting to see that live. I don't think once we come back to live performance, I would be as interested in doing that. So I do think there is a little bit of virtual fatigue. So, you know, putting too much energy in that, at least from our organization standpoint, is, you know, we really want to focus on live performances, which is what we do. I will say, though, you know, talking about getting ideas from other parts of the organization, one of the best ways to do that in a way which is a very good question about feeling overwhelming, not only to the team, but also to you as a manager who's like, why don't we have ice cream on the roof of the da-da-da in the middle of the summer? Like some really kind of wacky ideas that you want to be able to balance, like giving people a framework within, you know, within to ideate is really helpful. And an example of that exactly ties into our digital programming. We were talking, you know, we had planned to do some indoor performances as recently as this fall, when we thought that the numbers were coming down. They were coming down, and the key public health indicators quickly shot up in Wisconsin, which basically eliminated all of our reduced capacity planning for the winter. And we had invested in some new technology with fiber networking and streaming capability. And at one of our task force, as we're calling it, which is now probably going to turn into a permanent committee or group within the staff that's across departments, one of these discussions, well, what can we do with this, stuff that we were going to use, for the in-person? We had all this programming lined up, and it was our development director of all people who said, I heard about people doing recording concerts for hospital patients, particularly people who don't have access to, technology, and the hospitals were broadcasting it on their, closed circuit networks. And programming person said, that's a great idea. So I think it was, and that we did that, and it was really well received. And it is something we will continue to do likely after the pandemic. That is a perfect way for us to use technology and to use, the streaming and recording capabilities and skills we gained during the pandemic. But I think, giving the team a framework within which to ideate is probably the best solution to get the best ideas, as well as not, put a frustration on the team or yourself, frankly, with, a number of ideas that might be, hard to manage, if that answers the question.
Absolutely. I think that's very, very helpful. I think in just a few minutes remaining, I will try to combine questions. And I think there's one theme that seems to be emerging that we could maybe capitalize on that I'd love to ask all members of the panel to weigh in on. We talked about innovation through the digital space. We talked about innovating through programming. We spoke about even budget allocations and artist engagement. I think the piece that may still be a hopeful thing, in a word or two, I wonder if you might say anything from your lessons or just philosophical outlook on how to think about innovating and diversifying audiences. How does diverse choices in programming and artist engagement, how has that directly answered the question about diversifying audiences, or maybe has not? And what kind of lessons might we take with us on that? Let's see. Jenny?
So, we have a very, very diverse representation of art forms and artists on our digital series. And it's not, Sphinx is coming. We have artists we've worked with for a long time and artists who are new to us. And every program is presented side by side without any disclaimer or caveat. I think that consistency is important, that equity of representation is important, so that there isn't sort of a bucket that certain programming is put into that requires a lot of framing around it, and that that things that are topical and important to the artists are discussed throughout. So, Washington Performing Arts is very unique in that we have 2 gospel choirs, and people in the Washington, D.C. region who love gospel music, who perform it, know to come to Washington Performing Arts performances because we consistently present gospel throughout the year. Showing that depth over time begins to draw audiences, the same way as presenting classical music or jazz or dance or multidisciplinary arts. So I think organizations have to choose how they're going to invest and really go there without justifying as something that is different, but in fact co-locating so that great artists are great artists. You make your choices and then people can draw whatever inferences they will, but great art stands side by side. And that's the perspective we've taken in recent years and with this season. And I love if people look and say, wow, there are a lot of people I don't recognize, and there's a high proportion. It's probably about 50% this year for us. That's great because every artist is fantastic, all from different genres, different skills, ages, backgrounds, and that's exciting.
Absolutely, I love that. So being consistent, normalizing that diversity and really walking the walk and really recognizing, it sounds like recognizing that artistic merit isn't something you have to make excuses for or special considerations for. In fact, it lives everywhere. So by living that philosophy and consistently sharing diverse art and artists with all of your audiences will eventually shift that paradigm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd love to just quickly jump onto what Jenny said. I think the consistency word is key. I also think you can't expect to present, BIPOC artists a couple times a year and be confused as to why there are no BIPOC audience members. I would also add that if you are a venue, or even if you're not a venue, if you're a presenter that doesn't have a home, creating a space of belonging is almost as important as presenting BIPOC artists on your stages. So, and I say this as an organization that has been, that is definitely perceived, even though we're doing a little better than some of our colleagues in the city, as a place where old white people go to see things. And it wasn't until we actually did a very deep and challenging to hear research into this and to hear from the community what they thought of our venue, and then really start to change those perceptions through not only the programming, but the experience that they have coming to the space, that we were starting to make a dent in diversifying the audiences. So it's everything from who's working at, as ticket takers, as ushers, how they feel when they come in, and feeling that, like, I felt like that person was looking at me the wrong way or giving me a hard time because of this or that. All of that really adds to the issue of people feeling welcome and a sense of belonging.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. As we're completely out of time, though I know that we could spend a lifetime talking about these beautiful themes and ideas. I so really appreciate this brilliant panel for sharing the lessons and helping us all remember to be agile, vulnerable, and collaborative, and really to stick this out and take the lessons from before time into the present and really fortify that and project forward. So that we may all become partners and individuals and artists, as Ab put it, that we wish to become in service of our community. Thank you so much.
Thank you.